Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to the Neofusionist Book Review. This is not your typical book review, as I make no claims to political or philosophical impartiality. This podcast uses the format of a book review to explore the premise of neofusionism. Neofusionism is the merging of paleoconservatism with naturalism within the framework of the revitalization of the Republican Party. We will be exploring politics, philosophy, psychology, economics, and sociology through a wide variety of books published both recently and historically. Thank you for tuning in. For today's episode, we will be looking at The Virtue of Nationalism by Yoram Hazony. Now, this is a pretty recent book, one of the most recent books that I've read, published in 2018, so didn't just come out, but it came out pretty recently, and there's still a bit of buzz about the book. The author, Yoram Hazony, was one of the main organizers of the fairly recent National Conservatism conference, which has generated a lot of buzz. And I actually attended that conference. It was a fantastic conference. The speakers were all really insightful, and you can find a lot of the videos on YouTube of the various speakers, including the author here, Yoram Hazony, his speech at the event. And it was a really great event. I made a post on my website about it, a little bit about it, maybe more about the premise of national conservatism, and it was largely in response to someone else's article that they had written about the conference, and so I kind of talked a little bit about some of the things that I've talked about in this podcast. And anyway, it was a great conference. It seems to have generated some great discussions. This book as well has generated some great discussions, and so I think it's really important for me to discuss this. And also, the last episode, the paleoconservatives, we talked a little bit about nationalism in my review of the last essay in that book, which was about a new nationalism, and some of the sort of controversial statements in that. But I feel like paleoconservatism is intrinsically bound up with the concept of nationalism. Whether you say that paleoconservative is a branch of nationalism, which I've seen argued. I saw an article. I'll post a link to it that had argued that there are four different main types of right-wing nationalism within the Republican Party, and paleoconservatism is one of them. I tend to view nationalism sort of as an integral factor of paleoconservatism. So I guess I see the two a little bit more closely bound up than this article that I'm mentioning. But regardless, the way you structure these different ideas as what is a subcategory of what else or what have you. The point is that nationalism and paleoconservatism and populism and the different ideas that go along with these things are very ascendant right now in the Republican Party. And this book is probably the premier book that's out right now discussing nationalism. And so it's critical that I spend some time discussing this book. And so the book basically argues for why nationalism is the best global system, and it presents nationalism essentially as a worldview or a global structure, a system of independent nation states. Not so much as like nationalism as a feeling or a sentiment of some people will view it as nationalism as extreme patriotism, or I've seen a bunch of different definitions, generally of limited accuracy, I think, or limited relevance, let's say, to the way most American nationalists define themselves. I think that as we've looked at paleoconservatism, we've seen a definite trend toward non-interventionism Whereas a lot of people who aren't real familiar with nationalism or who are really critical of nationalism will look at, say, imperialism of like, our nation is the best. We must conquer other nations. We must advance the power of our nation at the expense of everyone else. Go America, my country, right or wrong, blah, 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 and say that is nationalism. That's not nationalism as defined by Hazony in this book. It's not nationalism as defined by, say, Patrick Buchanan or the general paleoconservative consensus. Nationalism is an arrangement of independent nation states, each of which allows other nation states to set their own course, and so it's opposed to imperialism, which is sort of a version of globalism. Or maybe globalism is a version of imperialism. I guess that's more the case that Hazony makes here. But at base, it's a system of independent nation states, each essentially minding their own business. That's nationalism as presented in this book, and that's, I think, how most modern American nationalists view their position. So, in this book, he basically describes what he calls the Protestant construction, and he basically says that this was created around the Peace of Westphalia after the 30 Years' War. That after this conflict between what's commonly viewed as a conflict between Protestantism and Catholicism, he presents it more as a conflict between an imperial Catholicism and a series of independent nation states, some of them Protestant, some of them Catholic. And at the end of the day, the empire, the imperial vision of Europe, lost out, and the Protestant construction was formed, so that all these different nation states are able to have different religious perspectives, able to manage themselves differently, and all coexist. None of them feeling the need or the right to impose their system on the other nations of Europe. That's kind of the Protestant construction, as he defines it. Now, he lays out two necessary principles of this Protestant construction. And I'll read those to you now. I believe he's going to mention them again in some of the parts that I'm going to read, and so it's good to have an understanding of what he means by that. So the first principle of the Protestant construction, he says, quote, number 1, the moral minimum required for legitimate government. First, the king or ruler, in order to rule by right, had to devote himself to the protection of his people and their life, family, and property, to justice in the courts, to the maintenance of the Sabbath, and to the public recognition of the one God, roughly the biblical 10 Commandments or precepts given at Sinai, which both Luther and Calvin regarded as a natural law that could be recognized by all men. These precepts were seen as providing the minimum requirements for a life of personal freedom and dignity for all. A government incapable of maintaining this moral minimum was one that had failed in its most basic obligations to the well-being of its people. And number 2, the right of national self-determination. Second, nations that were cohesive and strong enough to secure their political independence would henceforth be regarded as possessing what later came to be called a right of self-determination, by which was meant the right to govern themselves under their own national constitutions and churches without interference from foreign powers. Thus, while it was accepted that there exist natural minimum requirements for maintaining a civilized society, and that, in line with the first principle, these were binding upon all governments, it was not expected that all nations would become as one in their thoughts, laws, or way of life. End quote. So essentially these two principles, the first one, the moral minimum required for legitimate government, although he ties it very closely with God, and I think that during the time when this whole Protestant construction was created in Europe, that was how it was viewed, and that's maybe how it's viewed by him. I'm going to have to look at this as sort of there are nations all over the world that have different conceptions of God, and I think it's completely legitimate for a nation to be secular. I think it's completely legitimate for a nation to be polytheistic, or Buddhist, or whatever it may be, that it doesn't necessarily need recognition of the one God as he describes it, or the 10 Commandments, or any of that. But I think that the premise here is that if a nation if a ruler oppresses the people of his nation, is a tyrant, that's fundamentally illegitimate. That is an illegitimate government. So there is a moral requirement that a regime act in the best interests of the people of the regime, whether it's a democracy or not. But this is an area where it might be a little fuzzy, because when we look at someone like Saddam Hussein or Gaddafi, we might say, well, that's a tyrant, that's a dictator, that's therefore not a legitimate government. Maybe he doesn't rule via democracy, but does that give other nations the right to disregard the legitimacy of Iraq or Libya and enable them to attempt to influence regime change in order to advance the system of nation states to create or to promote a new nation state in those areas that would be more legitimate than the previous one? I think we've seen that doesn't work. So that moral minimum, although it exists insofar as, a pure genocidal psychopathic tyrant might be considered not legitimate. All right, I think we can generally agree on that. But it's a tough area to kind of draw the line as to what constitutes legitimacy and whether the system in place can really be overthrown or adjusted without a new system that might potentially be even worse than the previous. That's a gray area. I think the second principle is a little bit more concrete, that essentially says the right of national self-determination, that if a nation is capable of defending itself, securing the borders, securing the political independence, then that nation has the right to be a nation and has the right to set its own course, and that other nations don't have the right to control it. I'll read this one to you again because I think this is the more important of these principles. He says, nations that were cohesive and strong enough to secure their political independence would henceforth be regarded as possessing what later came to be called a right of self-determination, by which was meant the right to govern themselves under their own national constitutions and churches without interference from foreign powers. Thus, while it was accepted that there exist natural minimum requirements for maintaining a civilized society, and that in line with the first principle these were binding upon all governments, it was not expected that all nations would become as one in their thoughts, laws, or way of life. So that's kind of, the right of self-determination, the right for each nation to set its own course. So those are the two principles that he lays out as being fundamental to the Protestant construction. Now, from here he begins to look at the current situation, which he says is a deviation. He says the deviation has kind of begun with World War II and has followed, or in the aftermath of World War II, and this deviation has kind of continued on from there. He says that fascism and communism were both deviations from the Protestant construction, and that the principle of, say, the Atlantic Charter and the principle of Roosevelt and Churchill in opposing fascism and then later in opposing communism was to, principally in opposing fascism, was to reinforce the Protestant construction of a system of independent nation states. But that didn't happen after World War II, and largely on account of the Cold War. And so the Protestant construction has actually been under assault from not only fascism and communism, but also from what he calls the liberal construction. So that liberalism itself is not in support of this Protestant construction of independent nation states. And he talks at length about that and about this liberal construction, which I'm going to read a fairly long section here when he talks about that, because I think this is really important as we begin to criticize some of the components of liberalism and the roots of this liberal construction in the Enlightenment. We're beginning to take apart some of the ideas of the Enlightenment and the liberal construction or the liberal ideology and poke some holes in it and say, oh, this doesn't work for these reasons. So I'm going to read this part here. He says, quote, unlike the Protestant construction, which thrived on the tension between the two biblically derived principles of national freedom and the moral minimum for legitimate rule, the liberal construction of the West assumes that there is only one principle at the base of legitimate political order: individual freedom. A classical and still influential source for this idea is modernity's most famous liberal manifesto, John Locke's Second Treatise of Government. Published in 1689, it opens with the assertion that all human individuals are born in perfect freedom and perfect equality, and goes on to describe them as pursuing life, liberty, and property in a world of transactions based on consent. From this basis, Locke builds his model of political life and theory of government. Locke himself was a product of the Protestant construction, and his work was intended to strengthen it, not to undermine it. Nevertheless, in fashioning his theory, Locke downplayed or entirely omitted essential aspects of human nature and motivation, without which no political philosophy can make sense. Every theory involves a reduction or simplification of its material, of course, but a well-framed theory will capture the most consequential features of the domain being studied, while a poorly framed one will let crucial elements slip away unnoticed, and so it is with the second treatise, which offers a rationalist view of human political life that has abstracted away every bond that ties human beings to one another other than consent. In speaking of consent, Locke means that the individual becomes a member of a human collective only because he has agreed to it, and has obligations toward such collectives only if he has accepted them. This is flattering to the individual, since it makes it seem as though the important choices are almost always his to decide. However, it is painfully lacking as a description of the empirical political world, in which mutual loyalties bind human beings into families, tribes, and nations, and each of us receives a certain religious and cultural inheritance as a consequence of being born into such collectives. It ignores the responsibilities that are intrinsic to both inherited and adopted membership in collectives of this kind, establishing demands on individuals that do not arise as a result of consent, and do not disappear if consent is withheld. And it is oblivious to the effects of a common adversity which brings inevitable challenges and hardships to families, tribes, and nations, reinforcing the responsibilities to the collective, and turning them into the most acutely felt and often immovable features of the moral and political landscape. No intelligent account of politics, or of political obligation, can be devised that does not give great weight to these factors, and Locke's account, which elides them, is in effect a far-reaching depreciation of the most basic bonds that hold society together. Consider the family as an example. Most of us suppose that brothers and sisters born to the same parents have a special responsibility to help one another in a time of need that takes precedence over other obligations. In the same way, we would suppose that grandparents have obligations toward their grandchildren, and that grandchildren have obligations toward their grandparents. But none of these family relationships are the result of consent. One does not choose one's brothers or one's grandchildren. And so these obligations must derive from other sources. Locke's model, however, which seeks to found the family on free choice and consent, generates no such obligations. This is to say that anyone embracing the premises of the second treatise would be unable even to understand, much less defend, the existence of the family as we know it, and the ties of responsibility that give it shape. Much the same can be said of Locke's theory of the state. The state that is brought into being in the second treatise is the product of consent alone. Individuals feel that their life and property are insufficiently secure, so they choose to form a pact to defend those interests. But this pact in defense of one's property bears little resemblance to the national states that we know from experience. In real life, nations are communities bound together by bonds of mutual loyalty, carrying forward particular traditions from one generation to the next. They possess common historical memories, language and texts, rights and boundaries, imparting to their members a powerful identification with their forefathers and a concern for what will be the fate of future generations. I am thinking, for instance, of the way in which Fortescue's belief in the superiority of the laws of England resounded through the centuries of his heirs, or of the way in which England's historical dread of domination by Catholic Spain gave life to the institutions and wars in that land over generations. Attachments and dispositions such as these move the individual to serve his or her country, not only for the sake of their lives and property, but even at the cost of sacrificing these very things. Yet in most cases they are instilled in us in childhood, and are no more freely chosen than the identity of one's brothers and sisters or one's grandparents. A Lockean theory of the state does not enable us to understand, much less justify, the existence of the national state and the ties of obligation that give it shape. In reducing political life to the individual's pursuit of life and property, Locke did not merely offer an impoverished and unsuccessful account of human motivation and action. His political theory summoned into being a dream world, a utopian vision, in which the political institutions of the Jewish and Christian world, the national state, community, family, and religious tradition, appear to have no reason to exist. All of these are institutions that result from and impart bonds of loyalty and common purpose to human collectives, creating borders and boundaries between one group and another, establishing ties to future and past generations, and offering a glimpse beyond the present to something higher. An individual who has no motives other than to preserve his life and expand his property, and who is under no obligations other than those to which he has consented, will have little need for any of these things. Without intending to, the dream world offered by Locke's second treatise rendered most of the Protestant order senseless and superfluous. Locke's first readers were deeply troubled by this. It moved the great British statesman and philosopher Edmund Burke, for example, to declare on the floor of Parliament that of all books written, the second treatise was one of the worst. But the radical deficiency of Locke's account has gradually ceased to be recognized as a problem. Western intellectuals have come to delight in it. Until today, we are inundated with follow-up works, from Rousseau's On the Social Contract and Kant's Perpetual Peace to Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged and John Rawls' A Theory of Justice, tirelessly elaborating this dream world, working and reworking the vision of free and equal human beings pursuing life and property and living under obligations that arise from their own free consent. A theory or program that is committed to this rationalist framework is what I will call a liberal theory or program. It is worth paying particular attention to the inability of liberal political theories to account for the existence of borders between nations. Protestant political theory followed Hebrew scripture in considering national boundaries to be no less important for the peace and well-being of mankind than property boundaries. Locke's attempt to derive the existence of the state from the consent of an arbitrary group of property owners, however, eliminates this understanding of the nation as an intrinsically bounded entity living in a more or less determinate territory. In the second treatise, there is no, in principle, limit to the size of state or the number of people whose property it can propose to protect, and the state is in fact eerily without boundaries or borders of any kind. According to the law of nature, Locke writes, mankind are one community. The existence of political boundaries among men is, as far as he is concerned, nothing but a product of human corruption and viciousness. Since the law of nature is for Locke identical with universal reason, this means that men guided by reason, and therefore neither corrupt nor vicious, will have no need for national boundaries at all. End quote. So, we can see there a pretty scathing critique of John Locke. In previous works, particularly in The Cave in the Light, we looked at John Locke in a fairly positive light. He had proposed an empirical vision of human understanding that he kind of put forward the blank slate theory, which we've criticized, but at bottom his idea was that we gain our understanding of the world through observation. That's the theory anyway that was discussed in that book. Now, what we're looking at here in this book is a sort of a different perspective. That when we look at John Locke's explanation of the existence of the state and the motivations of humans and the nature of human interactions with each other and human interaction and participation with the state, none of this is really based on observation at all. It's based on this theory of free, equal, independent, autonomous individuals collaborating with each other through a consensual relationship to create a state to protect individual rights and individual property and things like that. That's not really that never happened. There was never a council of people getting together to say, let's make a government, let's make a state. People are bound to their families by the nature of reality, okay, by the nature of human procreation and the nature of human instincts and human behavior. We are bound into families. We are thrown into families through no choice of our own, and that's the way we exist. That's not something we choose, it's something we do. It's part of our function, it's part of our structure, it's part of our nature. And families and other families that have maybe ties of blood or ties of marriage or ties of geography will work together in the face of common threats. And so these become clans, they become tribes, they become larger and larger entities, and the premise of the nation state is that these aggregations of families and larger kin groups share some fundamental elements like culture and language that is different from neighboring kin groups and therefore they build nations based around those premises. This is all what we kind of observe as how people live. It's not based on some abstract theory. It's more like that's just through an observation of how people behave, we can see that the idea that everything is based around consent and that a nation is simply a collection of free and independent and equal individuals that's not really an accurate depiction. So this begins the real criticism of modernity and modern liberalism from a really empirical observational perspective. All right. And we're going to get into that criticism of modern liberalism in a number of books. We've already looked at it a little bit, but I think we're going to look at it in more detail in this book and in other books that we look at in the near future. So at this point, we're going to look at the premise of mutual loyalty, which is what Hazony proposes as the fundamental glue that binds a nation together. And it's not rooted in consent, but it's rooted in human nature. But as I've stated in previous episodes, there has to be some sort of glue that binds communities together. We're not just a bunch of people living in proximity with each other who have who automatically operate together. Proximity is obviously part of it, but there's more. It's more than that. It's deeper than that. And the reason that we act together as a nation and that we defend each other and we feel some sort of affinity for the nation is because of these ties of mutual loyalty. All right. So in this section, he says, quote, "Some things can be attained by the individual acting alone, but most aims or ends require that we act in concert with others. However, our neighbors have aims and motives of their own, and they are often uninterested in the goal we have proposed, if not hostile to it. How, then, can we influence others so that they act to accomplish the goals that we see as necessary or desirable? This is the fundamental problem of the individual living in a community of others. The need to find answers to this question gives rise to politics, which is the discipline or craft of influencing others so that they act to accomplish the goals one sees as necessary or desirable." One response to this fundamental problem is the establishment of standing bodies or collectives of individuals, the family, clan, tribe, or nation, a state or an army, a religious order, or a business enterprise. These and other institutions are human collectives that maintain their existence through time, holding fast to certain fixed purposes and forms, such as a particular name by which they are known and accepted procedures by which they make decisions and act as a body. Each institution teaches, persuades, or coerces its members to act according to these fixed purposes and forms, abiding by accepted general rules and procedures so that they can reliably act as a body, without each time having to be persuaded or coerced anew. But what brings individuals, despite having their own unique aims and motives, to join together in an institution, reliably acting as a body together with its other members, in accordance with the fixed purposes and forms of the institution? 3 possibilities are well known. First, individuals will join if threatened with reprisal. Second, they will join if they are offered payment or other advantage. Finally, they will join if they see the interests and aims of the institution as their own. Of these, the second alternative produces the weakest institutions, for those who join up in some arduous struggle or effort in exchange only for a sum of money are constantly calculating whether the risks are worth the pay and hoping that they will be able to defect to a different cause offering better pay and entailing fewer risks. Institutions are only somewhat more stable when individuals are recruited by intimidating them and their loved ones, since they cannot be relied upon once the threat is felt to recede and are forever on the verge of mutiny so long as it does not. For these and other reasons, strong institutions are established where the individuals involved identify the interests and the aims of the institution as their own. Think, for example, of a soldier who takes up a rifle in the hope of establishing the independence of his people after a long history of persecution. Such individuals do not need to be coerced to fight or to be well compensated for their services. The fact that they are fighting for the benefit of their people is enough for them to be willing to throw their lives into the balance for the sake of a collective, such as a tribe or a nation, stirring up an ardor in their breasts that moves them to acts of bravery and self-sacrifice that no intimidation or promise of pay could elicit. Many political theories assume that political events are motivated by the individual's concern for his own life and property. Yet anyone who has witnessed the behavior of individuals in wartime or under conditions of nonviolent conflict, as in an electoral campaign, understands that this assumption is wildly inaccurate. It is true that one is sometimes motivated by a concern for his own life or property, but human individuals are also capable of regarding the aims and interests of a collective or institution of which they are members as their own, and of acting upon these aims and interests even where such action will be detrimental to their lives and property. Indeed, political events are frequently determined by the actions of individuals whose motives are just of this kind. A political theory designed to understand human beings as they are in reality, and not to tell us stories about the adventures of some fantastic creature invented by philosophers, cannot avoid this capacity of the human individual to recognize the aims of the collective as his own. Astonishing, and yet as common as the air we breathe, this ability is with us every day and every hour. It is basic to our empirical nature, and there can be no convincing account of how strong human institutions are built unless this capacity is at its center. Let us therefore consider this matter more closely. We know that the human individual is by nature fiercely concerned to ensure the integrity of his or her own self. By the self, I mean in the first instance, the individual's physical body, which is protected by a reflexive urge to fight or seek immediate escape when threatened or maligned. However, this urge to ensure the integrity of the self is by no means limited to the protection of the body. The very same ferocity that the individual displays in protecting his physical body is also evident in the actions he takes to defend his reputation when accused or insulted, and it appears as well in the urge to protect his land or other physical possessions that he regards as his own. Indeed, the very love that he evidently feels for his wife and children and for his parents and for brothers and sisters, and that moves him to protect them when they are in danger, is nothing other than another name for this same urge to protect the integrity of his self, for these loved ones have been embraced, insofar as his own consciousness is concerned, within the rubric of his own self, and are experienced as if they were a part of him. This capacity to protect and defend others as if they were a part of one's own self is not limited to kinsmen. We see this same ferocity in the urge to defend a friend or a townsman, the member of one's platoon or street gang, or, more generally, any other human being who is, for whatever reason, regarded by the individual as a part of his self. And many other examples could be mentioned. What we see across the range of human activities and institutions, then, is that the self of the individual is by nature flexible in its extent. and is constantly being enlarged, so that persons and things we might have supposed would be outside of him and alien to him are in fact regarded as if they were a part of himself. When an individual includes a certain other within the purview of his or herself, we call this attachment loyalty. When two individuals have each taken the other under the protection of their extended selves, the bond that is established is one of mutual loyalty, which allows these two individuals to regard themselves as a single entity. The existence of such bonds of mutual loyalty does not mean that they entirely cease to be independent persons. These bonds do not eliminate the competition, insult, jealousy, and quarrels that are always present between individuals who are loyal to one another. A husband and wife may quarrel frequently, and brothers or sisters may bicker and fight, by these means seeking to adjust the hierarchy of relations between them. While these conflicts are taking place, they are experienced as a struggle between independent persons. But as soon as either of them faces adversity, the other suffers this hardship as if it were his own. And in the face of this hardship, the disputes that had troubled them before are temporarily suspended or entirely forgotten. Moreover, once the hardship before them has been overcome, they experience a sense of relief and pleasure, of walking together in joy, each recognizing the happiness of the other as his own. These experiences, in which another individual is recognized as part of one's own self, in adversity and in triumph, establish a strong distinction between an inside and an outside. An inside, comprising the two individuals, each of whom regards the other as part of a single entity, and an outside, from which a challenge arises against them, and in the face of which they experience a joint suffering and a joint success. Human institutions can and often do contribute to their cohesion by providing financial compensation to their members or by coercing them, but enduring and resilient institutions are those that are constructed principally out of bonds of mutual loyalty. The family is the strongest and most resilient of all small institutions known to human politics, precisely due to the existence of such ties of mutual loyalty between each member of the family and all of the others. These ties are partly biological and partly adoptive. A mother forever feels that the children she has carried are a part of herself, but adoptive family relations, such as those between a husband and wife, or between either of them and their in-laws, or between parents and an adopted child, are frequently no less powerful than those between parents and the children who are born to them. Particular bonds of family loyalty can thus be either birth ties or adoptive ties, but in either case their solidity and resilience are unmatched as a result of the daily shared experience of relying on family members for assistance and support, which establishes family members as part of one another's extended self." End quote. Okay, so this is a pretty interesting and important section here. We talk about the different sorts of ties that bind groups of people together, and he talks about, well, basically he's saying, why do people work together? Well, what is the point? What is the mechanism by which people work together toward common goals? And he proposes that, well, okay, sometimes people are paid to work together or given some sort of reward for working together. Sometimes they are coerced into working together or working toward some common goal. And sometimes they work together collectively because they have a sense of the collective goals being identified with the goals of the self. And he says that the first two of these are simply not sufficient for strong long-term collectives. That people are always seeking other ways of more beneficial relations, whether it's something else with more pay or to escape from the coercive force. But to identify the objectives of the collective with the objectives of the self is the most long-term stable method of collective action. And as an aside, I think it's important here that this is recognizing, number one, the existence of the collective and the importance of the collective. And this is a problem with classical liberalism, or what's commonly considered a right-wing version of liberalism, and this is like libertarianism, that it's all about the self, and any collective action at all is damaging or destructive, particularly any non-voluntary collective. That's just not a really thorough understanding of reality. But anyway, so this sort of identifying the objectives of the collective with the objectives of the self comes from this sort of loyalty, and when people feel that the other people who one has adopted into one's sense of self, when they're threatened, you come to their aid, and when you're threatened, they come to your aid. This is this mutual loyalty that he's speaking of, and this mutual loyalty of two individuals or many individuals coming to the defense and supporting the other individuals within this greater sense of self. That is the glue that binds a strong collective together. And then he talks about the family, and the family as the strongest small collective entity, specifically because all of the ties that bind families together are all rooted in mutual loyalty. There may be reward and punishment, particularly of parents to children, but that's not the root of how the family is held together. The root of the family's bonds are those of mutual loyalty. And he talks about an inside and an outside, so that there are members of the collective, there are members of the shared sense of self, and then there are external elements outside that collective sense of self from which threats arise and that must be dealt with collectively. And that's just a part of human nature. That's the way people have always operated and always will operate. So that's kind of really the fundamental premise of this book. Now, he does talk about a few other things. He talks about like different visions of the organization of the world. He talks about anarchy, which would be the limiting of human collective action to the family and the larger clan, but without moving to the position of the nation state, where a large collective of tribes and clans all becomes a single cohesive unit with specific boundaries and a specific common system of law, and it's almost like a super tribe, except that it's unified. It's not broken down into different groups within it with different systems of justice. It treats all people within this tribe, regardless of whether it's a brother or somebody who's a member of a different tribe but is part of the same nation. I mean, there has to be some kind of commonality, but membership in this nation, all people within this nation are considered equal, and so that minimizes the strife between members of the nation. And then there's the imperial view, which is that the whole world, that peace will be acquired when we transcend not only anarchy, but we also transcend the nation state, and the whole world comes under one common system of government. And that imperial state, which we strive toward, will be the ultimate position of world peace. All right, those are the sort of, on the one hand, maybe a smaller point of division, and maybe on the other hand, no points of division at all, where the entire planet becomes one collective unit. And then the system of nation states is sort of an intermediate between those two, and it is the most beneficial and healthiest vision of world order, right? So that's what he's arguing in this book. Now, I want to read a section here. He talks about some of the virtues of the nation state, some of the reasons why this system of nation states is better than what he terms anarchy, which is, it's not an anarchy in the sense of all autonomous individuals each acting in their own interests. That's simply not ever going to happen, but instead like a system of families, extended families, and clans all acting in the interests of their smaller kin groups, and instead of the state. And then he compares it to this imperial position, which I described, and he describes four main reasons why this is. He describes four main reasons why this is the best system of government. The first of which is that violence is predominantly banished to the periphery, so that, as I said, the different members of the nation are not constantly quarreling with each other, but they're all assumed to be united, and they're all using a universal system of justice to adjudicate conflicts between them. There's not inter-tribal warfare, or one clan fighting against another clan. Violence is just like, okay, the only legitimate violence should be, the maintenance of order and the maintenance of a system of justice, whose power solely lies in the hands of the state. But primarily, violence is intended to be banished to the periphery, so that legitimate violence would only occur in defending the nation state from external threats. The second would be a disdain for imperial conquest. The violence and the strife that arises from constant quests toward imperial power would be reduced or eliminated, ultimately eliminated by a planet that is entirely bound to this system of independent nation states. The third would be collective freedom, so that each individual within a single nation has the most opportunity to advance their own particular freedom and live their life in the way that they see fit, because they are not seen as a fundamental threat to the other people of other clans within the nation. And I don't want to get into any of those three particularly. It's the fourth one that I'm a little bit more interested in at this time, because this ties back a little bit with my concern about cultural evolution. And this fourth one is the competitive political order. So he says, quote, "It was the mark of Napoleon's imperialism that he could countenance no states that were not modeled after his own revolutionary regime, in effect establishing one legal system for all of Europe. Even as ancient an institution as the Venetian city-state, whose constitutional traditions had survived for more than 1,000 years, was to him no more than an abomination that had to be destroyed. This same conviction that one has grasped the ultimate political truth, and that all must now accept it, likewise characterized Lenin's thought and Soviet imperialism during its entire 70-year course. And it appears again in our own time in the doctrines of European Union, which finds no satisfaction in the role of one nation, but seeks constantly to impose an ever greater uniformity on all nations in accordance with the political truths its bureaucrats regard as universally evident." All three of these European imperial states saw themselves as applying, each in its own way, the Enlightenment doctrine of a universal reason, which dictates a single evident political truth for all mankind. The principle of national freedom is premised on an entirely different and indeed opposite view of mankind's capacity for knowledge. It is premised on the supposition that political truth is not immediately evident to all, whether through the exercise of reason or by any other means. As John Selden emphasized, human reason is capable of arriving at virtually any conclusion, and has never in history been able to arrive at a single political truth that all can agree upon. Thus, the importance of national freedom, which permits each nation to develop its own unique purposes, traditions, and institutions that may be tested through painstaking trial and error over centuries. This conception of the need for a diversity of nations, each pursuing the truth according to its own understanding, is not intended to deny that there are principles of government and morals that are best. What is denied is that these principles are known to anyone who will but exercise reason to try to get to them. The great English philosopher and statesman insisted on the legitimacy of diverse national traditions because of his empiricism. It is only through the many national experiments that we can learn over historical time what is in fact best. The choice between an imperialist and nationalist politics thus corresponds to a choice between two theories of knowledge. In Western history, at least, imperialism has tended to be associated with a rationalist theory of knowledge, having an unbounded trust in human reason, such a theory is bold in its assertion that the great universal truths are already at hand and that this knowledge needs now only to be brought to bear on humanity. Nationalism, on the other hand, has tended to be based on an empirical standpoint, exercising a moderate skepticism with regard to the products of human reason, and mindful of the calamities that men have brought upon us in the political realm time and again by their overconfidence in their own reason. And, being skeptical, it recognizes the wisdom of permitting many attempts to attain the truth, each different from the others. In this way, some experiments will be successful, while others will fail. And those that succeed will do so in different ways, so that the unique experience of each nation will teach us different things that we had not understood before. We may say, in other words, that a nationalist politics invites a great debate among the nations and a world of experiments and learning, whereas an imperialist politics declares that this debate is too dangerous or too troublesome and that the time has come to end it. A similar argument between rationalist and empiricist theories of knowledge is familiar from economics. The socialist has always believed that the necessary knowledge is at hand, so there is no need for competition in the marketplace. The economy needs only to be directed by a rational planner who will dictate the transactions that are to proceed for everyone's benefit. The capitalist, on the other hand, has understood this proposal to be nothing but a conceit, a product of human arrogance and folly, because in reality there is no human being and no group of human beings that possesses the necessary powers of reason and the necessary knowledge to correctly dictate how an entire economy should proceed for everyone's benefit. Instead, the capitalist argues from a skeptical and empirical point of view that we should permit many independent economic actors and allow them freely to compete in developing and providing economic products and services. It is understood that because of each of these competing business enterprise pursues a different set of aims and is organized in a manner that is different from the others, some will succeed and some will fail. But those that succeed will do so in ways that no rational planner could have predicted in advance, and their discoveries will then be available for the imitation and refinement of others. In this way, the economy as a whole flourishes from this competition. The political order is in this respect much like the economic order. The reality is that no human being and no group of human beings possesses the necessary powers of reason and the necessary knowledge to dictate the political constitution that is appropriate for all mankind. Anyone tending to a skeptical and empirical point of view will thus recognize the advantages of a nationalist order, which permits many independent national states and allows them freely to compete. Each national state pursues a different set of aims and is organized in a manner that is different from the others. And yet, despite this diversity, the rulers of these independent national states, in constant competition with other members of the order of similar states, are also forever glancing sideways at their competitors to see what is bringing them success, imitating that which they regard as wise and useful and beautiful in the institutions of other nations, in order to improve their own. In this way, the rulers of each nation, while concerned principally for the strength and standing of their own nation among its competitors, nevertheless end up sharing with all humanity from their own unique store of experiment and experience. End quote. This is key. This section right here is important. Okay? This ties back to many of the things that we've spoken about thus far. An empirical perspective allows for a plurality, a variety, a diversity of different systems, different economic systems, different national systems, and it's similar to how the free market works. Okay, in a free market system, the different economic actors or businesses or individuals, corporations, etc., the different entities within an economy, each has the freedom to chart its own course. And through that freedom and that plurality of different maybe business models, different product offerings, or what have you, different ways of running a business, the ones that work will advance, the ones that don't work will fail. This freedom to succeed or fail and this plurality of different ideas is similar to biological evolution. It's similar to cultural evolution, the evolution of tradition, and it's the same thing as the evolution of different political systems. The political systems that work will be adopted by other similar nation states. Nation states will see what works in other nation states and adopt those systems because they want to succeed in a competitive system. So therefore, the traditions, the systems, the political systems need to have, they follow an evolutionary process. What I'm describing is akin to an evolutionary process. It is the survival of the fittest of national political systems. And it follows along the same system as biological evolution. Okay? This is an empirical system because it says that in order to find the truth of what works, we have to try a bunch of different things, which are like experiments. Each nation is like an experiment. We have to try a bunch of different things and see what works through observation, rather than what he describes as the rationalism of imperialism, which says we know what works. We've figured out what works. We know what works. All we have to do now is impose it. Two very different systems. Imperialism is like socialism, and nationalism is like capitalism, is the argument that he's making. And both capitalism and nationalism are empirical and evolutionary. All right, that's the case that I'm making. That's the case that he's making in this section of the book. And so I think that is a really important point. And it's rooted in the very same principles that we looked at when we looked at A Conflict of Visions from Thomas Sowell, is that it's an epistemological question of whether or not human beings are constrained or unconstrained. If we are unconstrained, then by definition we have the capacity to achieve perfect reason and perfect knowledge. If we are constrained, then our individual ability, or even the ability of groups of people, to achieve perfect knowledge and perfect reason is constrained. We don't have that capacity. All we can do is work towards it and try to get as close as we can toward correct understanding of the best political system. But we can't have the arrogance to say, I know what's best. We can try and say, I think I know what's better than everyone else's, and this is what I'm going to promote. But we have to shun the arrogance that says, I know what's best, I'm certain of it, I'm so certain, in fact, that this is best, that I'm willing to impose it. That's a fundamental epistemological question. It's a fundamental question about human knowledge and human capacity to achieve understanding. So that's a really important point. That's what ties this whole premise back to the stuff that I've been talking about thus far. And that ties this nationalism into the evolutionary empiricism that I've been speaking of, into the naturalism. This is why nationalism and naturalism are such good allies, if you will. Why the one leads to the other. A truly naturalistic approach is epistemological is empirical and is based on evolution and observation. So I think I've gone over that pretty solidly. There's a lot more in this book that he talks about. Obviously, that only covered a few of his points. He makes many great points. He talks about hatred and the common argument that nationalism is a source of hatred, and he disputes that pretty aggressively. And I think he makes a lot of really good points that it's not actually based on hatred. It's based on love and tolerance, love for your own people and tolerance of other nations to find their own way. But I'm not going to go into all that. I've reached about the point when I want to start wrapping things up here. So I encourage you to check out my social media. You can search Neofusionist on Facebook or on Twitter, and you'll find me. Those are the main two social media sites that I use. And you can find me on Patreon if you want to support the show. And you can leave me a review on If you get this through iTunes or Google Play or whatever, you can leave a review. And that's about all. I will see you again next episode. Thanks for tuning in. Bye.